Hi, my name is Kelly Smith. I'm with the National Drought Mitigation Center here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. It is my great pleasure to moderate our panel this morning. Our panel is a follow-up on the UNCCD COP16 meeting that took place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia last December. UNCCD stands for the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and it's one of the major UN organization combating land degradation and desertification. And a COP meeting is a committee of the parties. They happen periodically. So the 16th one, big international meeting, was last December in Saudi Arabia. And the folks here today were at that meeting, and they're going to tell you about what did and didn't come out of it. So our first panelist today is Dr. Daniel Segai. He is a program officer with the UNCCD, and I will let you further introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. I think I'm going to project the screen. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm Daniel Segai. I'm a program officer in charge of the drought and water scarcity portfolio of the Secretariat of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. And yeah, from commitment to action, the UNCCD's role in shaping drought resilience and land restoration is the title of our session. And my presentation is just structured as follows. First, I'm going to highlight a bit about what the UNCCD is all about, and of course, why drought. And then some of the initiatives that have been going on that were launched at COP16, and that the future is yet to come. So the UNCCD is a United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, is the global vision and voice for land. We are one of the 3 Rio conventions. You know about the Convention on Climate Change, Convention for the Biological Diversity, and we are the Convention for Land. So these are the 3 Rio conventions that were created in 1992. So of course it was adopted in 17 June 1994, so we just celebrated our 30th anniversary. And it went into, or entered into force in 1996, and it is so far the only legally binding framework to set up to address desertification and the effects of drought. 196 countries are parties of this convention, plus the European Union, 197 parties. So why drought? Why should we care about drought? Of course, as of last year or this year, 1 in 4 people are affected by drought globally, and 85% of those affected live in low and middle income countries. So I always keep saying drought knows who to attack, and of course also gender is a little bit more. Drought also knows gender. There is a lot of disproportionate effect of drought on women and children. The 30% increase in drought in the last 20 years only, and 40% extent of the global freshwater demand is projected. It will outstrip supply by 2030. And of course, sun and dust storms is also one of the disasters that we look into. It's driven by human activity, and 25% are human-made by droughts. So drought resilience is important. Why? Because, first of all, drought resilience investment. We did a lot of global publications that were launched at COP16, and the turn on the drought resilience investment is 1 to 10. If you invest $1, you'll be able to get a return on $10. So I think it makes a lot of economic sense to invest on drought resilience. And also, we did also another study which also gave something like a 1 to 3 building resilience ratio. So improving early warning. So I'm just trying to see that drought resilience investment is important, and it gives a lot of economic sense to also invest in economics. We also published a global atlas on drought at COP16, where it says major drought events and the impacted systems all along the world, and we can see that drought, there is no country which is immune to drought, and it's happening everywhere. And we were able to really attract the attention of all our parties of the UNCCD that drought is not going to go anywhere. We need to deal with it, and it is getting a lot more frequent and intense. So I'm just going to not walk you through, but at least the UNCCD has gone a long way now to really bring up to speed in terms of the impacts of drought and what to do on droughts, especially from the 2013, which my colleague Mark Svoboda is going to highlight. There was a high-level meeting on national drought policy in Geneva, and another one, after 11 years, we had one in October in Geneva. So there was a long way in between also on Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. There was an IWG, Intergovernmental Working Group on Drought, that parties established. And we have also in the room Mark, who was in the IWG, So there was a lot of work done to really mitigate the impacts of drought at the global level. And I'm going to highlight what has happened at COP16 in a minute, but at least we are heading also to Mongolia in 2026, to hoping that there would be some global policy instrument adopted at COP16. So this is a long way, and a lot has happened in between. So one thing that I also wanted to mention is there is an International Drought Resilience Alliance. It is a global coalition that is spearheaded by the governments of Spain and Senegal. And of course, a lot of government entities, but also international organizations are part of this alliance. And it is trying to really create a global momentum around drought. We have been talking about drought at the minister level. Now countries are talking, heads of states level are discussing drought resilience issues. And it is a great achievement, at least for the convention and for the parties of the convention. So 4 pillars for the Drought Resilience Alliance. One is the building political momentum for the agenda, common framework to accelerate action, and then knowledge sharing, innovative finance for drought resilience. I'm not going to go into details, but if you are interested or if you want to be part of this alliance, please talk to me after the event. So one of the outcomes of this International Drought Resilience Alliance is the observatory that we are working with a lot of partners also in the room. And this observatory is a groundbreaking initiative. It is championed by Spain and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to revolutionize global drought resilience. So it is a lot of critical information is emerging on how to become resilient to the effects of drought. But we are trying to, at least the entry point for this observatory is connecting data and information, because it is fragmented, it is scattered everywhere, and it is a huge investment that is being done by HYDRO, connect data and science for a meaningful action. So HYDRO provides key indicators for drought resilience so that decision makers can select the right strategies. No one size fits all. So what we are trying to do is making sure that what data generates is meaningful for context-specific decision making. So if you are also interested on HYDRO, to be part of HYDRO, because we just published at COP16 the prototype, and the full operational HYDRO will be launched at COP17. And the pillars, or how to say, the components of the HYDRO are prepare, adapt, mitigate, and anticipate drought. So the core features are where there will be a data search, analytics and insights, artificial intelligence, snapshots, reporting, and alerts. It is still work in progress, but there is some core functions of this HYDRO. We are also going to have a landing page, mapping indicators, interactive globe, curated data stories, news and insights. So it is going to be a kind of a real platform to help countries to make sure that they make a meaningful decision based on case studies, based on their own data. There will be a lot of case studies also from all over the world, including for Africa, Asia. Somebody was talking about the day zero from South Africa, for example, this morning. And Cape Town, this is what I heard this morning. So some kind of data, just live data that is going to be useful for at least making the decision in terms of, and also HYDRO will have a scholar feature that will leverage the latest AI for domain scientists around the world. So we are working with the University of Yale to really do this kind of immersive data ownership. And we have a lot of key stakeholders for the first phase, but we are looking for more partners in the second phase. So the key outcomes from the COP16, one thing that I also wanted to mention is there were a lot of discussion about a global policy instrument for drought, like a climate protocol, Paris Agreement. We need something like that for drought. So unfortunately, parties were not able to come into agreement at COP16, and the differing options were two. One was global framework for drought resilience, another one was for a global binding protocol on drought, and in the end, they just decided to continue discussing this at COP17 in Mongolia. But the good news is at least parties were able to get some financial commitment for enhancing drought resilience. The Riyadh Global Drought Resilience Partnership, it is in real money about $150 million for around 80 countries which are drought-prone and drought-vulnerable countries. They are going to be beneficiaries of this And of course, around 12.15 billion was also granted from OPEC Fund, Islamic Development Bank, Arab Coordination Group. So at least there was a lot of what we call this session now from commitment to action. Countries have now started to really support countries to come up with drought resilience, and we will see a lot of action going on the ground. And also, I think there was a lot of work also around many partners who are going to be supporting this financial facility. And we also launched, I think I mentioned a bit about the World Drought Atlas, but the economics of drought was also generating a lot of political traction. I said 1 to 10, 1 to 3, and the final publication that we had was 1 to 27, especially if you invest on nature-based solutions for drought, which Kari is going to be mentioning about from the Nature Conservancy. So this was also very well received by parties, the economics of drought resilience, because the narrative has to change. We are not mitigating the impacts of drought to save lives and livelihoods, because it also makes economic sense to invest on drought resilience. So this is something that we are looking into so that we change the narrative, stepping back from precipitate, transforming land management, the global threat of drying lands. So a lot of publications were launched at COP16. Just before I finish, I'm going to mention a bit about the community of learning and practice that we are also working on, that we launched at COP16, where we try to bring all the stakeholders on drought together. We had a UNCCD drought toolbox, but it was not interactive. So I think it's very important that we create a community, and we have a global community, but also regional communities. People can really interact. There is a lot of peer-to-peer learning, networking opportunities, access to innovative solutions, policy support. So if you go to the UNCCD CLP on drought, you'll be able to get into all these communities. And please sign up. We have around 330 or 340 members. It is growing by the day. And you can join, you can click on the automatically join, and then there are a lot of, I think there is a lot of procedure, just very short procedure, but at least there is a procedure to join this community. So one thing that I wanted to say is maybe drought is riding at the global agenda. It is becoming a global agenda. It will not be an exaggeration for those who were at COP16. Drought dominated the discussion in the 2 weeks at the conference. Although there was a stalemate, but at least it says a lot about the threat of drought as a global threat. So it's expected to dominate also future negotiations at COPs in the future COPs. And also, drought is not is a development and security issue. It's not simply the absence of rain. And we see it everywhere. And we are trying to also tell people that what we see everywhere is not directly impacted by drought, but indirectly. So it's a threat multiplier. Drought is a long-run game, and solutions must support healthy land and ecosystems. And we need drought impacts urgently. But sometimes countries make an excuse that we don't have the data, so we cannot measure. So data gaps are not an excuse for inaction. We know it is impacting us hard. Coordination across sectors and regions is crucial. And I'm going to speak a bit, maybe in tomorrow's session, about the need for integration. Global cooperation and collaboration is also imperative, and we see it happening more and more these days. With this, I just wanted to finish, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. I think we're going to take one question for each of our panelists right after they speak, and then we'll get into more questions and discussion afterwards. So does anyone have one question at this point related to anything you've heard about the UNCCD COP16? Well, I have a question, if no one else does. As we know, droughts don't follow the rules of borders and boundaries. They go across sectors. They affect more than one sector at once, more than one country at once. They might be local, they might be national, they might be international. Mm-hmm. Given all that, how do we know who plays what role?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is, I think, very important question. When it comes to droughts, you see it somewhere in an agriculture or livestock ministry in one sector, and then it is something that is dealt with one sector, and then when drought strikes, it becomes a national issue. So what we are trying to change with the drought initiative is we need a National Drought Risk Management Commission at the highest level. And many of the countries, the 80+ countries that are going to be working with us on this drought resilience initiative has now a commission, at least they have it in their plans. This is the first step of the 10 steps that you establish a national coordinating commission, because drought knows no boundaries, as you said it, but also no sectors. Drought is not a sector, it is a connector. So I think the whole thing to do is, first we need to create an institution that is able to not only enforce but also dictate action on drought preparation, not to respond to drought, but to prepare for drought. So this is the first step in their national drought plans. And I think with this, it resonates with many countries now, because this drought initiative has been for around 8 to 9 years now. So I think we need to institutionalize drought preparedness. This is the way we can cross or break the silos, because there is a lot of silos, and we even sometimes also misguide. We talk about agricultural drought, meteorological drought, hydrological drought, but at the end of the day, it's drought. So it's also impacting lives and livelihoods. So we need to really break the silos, and this is how we are trying to support countries too. And there is a lot of need for the involvement of the private sector, the CSOs, indigenous communities, because if they don't participate, they don't own. If they don't, so I think there was a lot of activities and participation by all these actors at COP16. It was huge. And we are hopeful that this is going to be now resonate with many countries, that we need to move as one and not just respond and then it becomes a national issue, but it should be a national issue before it strikes hard. This is what we are trying to say in terms of the paradigm shift. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So just to underscore Daniel's point, planning ahead, having those conversations, starting to dissolve the walls. Okay, next we're going to hear from Kari Viggerstall with the Nature Conservancy, telling us some about what the private sector can help do. So please, and further introduce yourself as
Great. Thank you
would
so
like.
much, Gil.
You bet.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Kari Viggerstall, and I am the Director of Water Security Science and Innovation at the Nature Conservancy. And just to start off, I thought I'd do a quick introduction. You heard from two of my colleagues this morning on the panel, from Lindsay and Clay. But just to take a step back and so you can understand why we're showing up in this conversation around drought resilience, wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are and how we're showing up. So we are a global conservation organization. We've been around over 70 years, and we're in 70 countries, all the US states as well. And we are driving forward the mission around conservation of the lands and waters in which all life depends. And we do this in deep partnership with a whole variety of partners, from indigenous groups to government agencies to the private sector. And we pride ourselves on being a very science-based organization and rooted in place. So delivering on conservation and sustainability, resilient systems on the ground through best practices, as well as having this view to this broader global change. And that's where my role is on a global team, trying to take what we're learning on the ground and bring it to these kinds of conversations here to try to scale up what's working in different places around the globe. And our role in what we're talking about here today in the UNCCD COP, in our role as a steering committee member on IDRA, is a few different things as I see it. First of all, bringing that experience and collaboratively advancing drought resilience on the ground, and bringing the best-in-class science around the role of nature in building drought resilience. We also had a lot of experience engaging at the national level in the different countries where we're working on changing policy and helping on advancing national planning, for example, around national adaptation planning or national biodiversity planning. So we're really excited about the Riyadh partnership and the support that's being put forward on national drought resilience planning and being able to share experiences and help support that effort. And thirdly, we have a lot of deep experience in working with the private sector. So Lindsay shared a little bit about that. And we have a lot of different ways we work with the private sector in advancing resilience building. And then we also have experience bringing innovative finance solutions to scaling really critical solutions across the globe. So for example, we have a number of watershed investment programs in different countries and in the US as well, or water funds that use different kinds of financing mechanisms to implement water security solutions across a watershed. We also have debt for nature swaps to help advance conservation and sustainable investment funds. So those are just a few examples of the types of innovative finance that we're trying to bring to help scale these kinds of solutions, and I think could be really relevant to the drought resilience conversation. So now that you have an introduction to why I'm here, what our organization is trying to do in this space, I want to take a step back and just talk about resilience building. And I think the business of resilience building is a really messy, process because we're trying to work across boundaries and borders, as we were just talking about. We're trying to work across sectors. We're trying to bring together urban and rural and really and work together across different kinds of systems. And when I think about building resilience within our food and water systems, I think we need to be thinking about advancing simultaneously solutions in our natural systems, in our built systems, and in our management systems. And I think I'll provide an example of what I'm talking about by grounding it in place. So I think a really good example of a place here in the US that is dealing with long-term drought and trying to build resilience of their food, water, energy systems is the Colorado River Basin, as many of you are aware, which has been undergoing a long-term drought and in a system that was already over-allocated. And we, as a Nature Conservancy, are working with a number of partners, and I know a lot of different agencies, community groups, cities, others are working on addressing resilience in the basin. But just an example of how we're working in these different systems to build overall resilience. In our natural system, we are working in the upper part of the watershed in improving management of the forest system for a few different reasons. One, to help reduce the risk of catastrophic forest fires, which can have a devastating impact on water supply systems downstream. It's also really important because the majority of the water in the basin comes from the snowpack that happens in these places. So forest management can really affect what happens to that snowpack and what happens to the water then downstream. In the built system, we're working with farmers to help improve irrigation systems, both diversion and on-farm irrigation systems, to help reduce water losses. And in terms of management, we're working with others to build water banks to make it easier for sharing water across users in any given year. So that's just an example of how you might work in these different systems. And there's so many other solutions underway in the basin that are working together to try to build that overall resilience. But even as I posit that nature is just one part of or one type of system we need to work in, we do believe in, and that's the lens that we're bringing to the conversation, that nature is a really important part of and is foundational to building drought resilience and overall resilience. So TNC, and this is what TNC brings to the conversation here, to UNCCD COP, and to the other COPs, such as the biodiversity and climate COP, is thinking about across these different systems and how nature is showing up, both as a solution, and I'll get into the nature-based solutions that we're implementing in different places across the globe, but also in noting that ecosystems are also suffering under increased frequency and severity of drought. And we need to keep that in mind as we're building these drought resilience plans, as we're making global commitments, to think about the impact of drought on ecosystems and making sure that we're planning for that and building that resilience to also mitigate for those impacts. And that's something that I think is not showing up strongly enough yet in some of the commitments and conversations. At the UNCCD COP, there was quite a lot about land degradation, obviously, because that's kind of front and center. But freshwater ecosystems, for example, were sort of missing for some of the conversations and commitments. So that's something we'll continue to push for as we go forward in this space. So as I mentioned, the other side of the coin is nature as a solution in this resilience building and drought resilience. And here are some examples of different kinds of nature-based solutions that include protection of ecosystems, restoration of ecosystems, but also improved practices on working lands that can help deliver on improved water security in the places where we implement them. And the benefit of nature-based solutions and why we think they're so important to bring to bear are not only their ability to address the priority water security challenges, such as water scarcity, as well as water quality, but also their ability to deliver on other kinds of benefits, which are really relevant to the myriad of challenges we're facing globally and locally, including helping to sequester carbon, helping communities adapt to climate change, to delivering on biodiversity protection and restoration, and a variety of other types of human health and well-being and socioeconomic benefits. So they're a really powerful solution in our toolbox of building drought resilience, because they can now also help us think about being able to meet some of the other challenges that we all have. And we were really pleased to see how much nature-based solutions showed up in the conversation in Riyadh, and in some of the commitments that were being discussed. And we'll continue to bring our experience to that in implementing nature-based solutions and helping to move that forward. And the good news is there are a lot of examples across the globe of nature-based solutions being implemented at scale across a whole watershed in order to deliver on the kinds of benefits we're looking for. So the Nature Conservancy has dozens of stories I can share with you. If we have time, I can go into them in more detail, but we have a lot of examples in North America, in Latin America, in Africa, in Europe, and so we are happy to share those experiences of what works. It's not always easy to implement nature-based solutions, even though they're a really powerful solution set. It takes a different kind of skill set than we have already out there in many cases to bring these to scale. But there are also many other organizations, local, regional, global organizations, implementing these types of solutions at scale. And one of the things we did at UNCCD COP16 was to bring together a number of these organizations to share their stories, to share the lessons learned that they had about doing this kind of work. And one of the things that was interesting was to see the commonalities around the challenges in implementing and scaling nature-based solutions, as well as how they're meeting those challenges. But also we're reminded of the importance of context of place, because each place is very different, and having a deep understanding of the local context and deep relationships with partners on the ground is really critical to have long-term success in implementing nature-based solutions, as it is with many of the kinds of solutions we're putting forward. So before I leave you, I just wanted to talk about some of those core elements for resilience building. I think this list will look somewhat similar to what Daniel shared with us just a few moments ago. I think the first bullet is probably one of the most important, and one of the things that has changed over the last several years around drought management. Thinking about proactive versus reactive solutions, thinking about it ahead of time so that we put our investment and our solution sets into how to be prepared for drought versus spending all of our investments on when a drought is happening, just how to deal with it in that moment. It's really important that we're bringing forward multi-scalar approaches that can work local, national, global levels. Again, cutting across borders and other boundaries is critically important to actually get this work done. There's a need, definitely, for more capacity building around drought resilience planning and implementation, and that planning, and really excited again about the partnership supporting at national level the ability to plan for drought resilience. As I mentioned, we have a lot of experience in innovative investments, and I do think that is going to be critical to making this happen and to meeting the challenge of the day, having enough investment to make these, to implement these solutions at the scale needed. And then finally, policy and global commitments are essential to move these actions forward at a global scale, but down to the local level in terms of having the energy, the investment, the resources behind them. And you heard a little bit about that in the panel this morning. So with that, I think I'll leave it right here. If you want to learn more about thinking through, for example, nature-based solutions around drought resilience or resilience to increasing risks and frequency of flooding, which the Accelerating Adaptation Report covers both of those, or you want to hear about more cases of implementing these solutions at scale, these resources can help bring that to you. And feel free to email me at any time whether you want to talk here or after this conference more about how we're thinking about the role of nature in building drought resilience. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Would anyone like to follow up with Kari? Something you'd especially like to hear addressed? Sorry, there's a question?
Yeah,
yes,
there.
Quentin.
Yeah, I was just curious about. Oh, there is a mic. Hello. I was just curious how you navigate conflict where water demand and particularly, resilience in like providing water to communities may come into conflict with actually natural ecosystems. In particular, I'm thinking of a study that came out of ASU about the Upper Colorado and how there was a proposal to basically thin trees along the Upper Colorado to increase stream flow so that there's more water for particularly Phoenix.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that comes up time and again. I think the conflict between people and nature and meeting the needs of both. And so, yeah, I think as an organization, we try to navigate that as clearly as possible in terms of bringing those different kinds of parties and interests together to develop integrated solutions that everyone is supportive of. So that's interesting case to hear about. That sort of, I know that people have talked about, hey, we should cut down trees to create more water, but I don't think we support sort of getting rid of all vegetation to create more water, because that vegetation is really important in managing the water. For example, in the Upper Colorado, the forest management I talked about it can be really important in keeping the snowpack on the landscape longer into the drier season. So it's about balancing the kinds of solutions that work for providing water for people, for agriculture, as well as considering what water is needed for different ecosystems and on those terrestrial ecosystems, because that's really tightly connected. So yeah, a really important question, something that comes up quite a lot.
Thanks very much.
Sure.
Okay, our next speaker is Mark Swoboda, the director of the National Drought Mitigation Center.
Is the mic on? Yeah, there we go. Good morning. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more drought. We're also celebrating a birthday this year. This doesn't look like my talk. That's a lot of slides to go through. Okay, I'll go through these real quick. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so we're celebrating our 30th year this year. In fact, I interviewed for my initial position 30 years ago this next month in May. And Kelly was with us too at the very beginning. We had about 5 people. So the Drought Center now has grown to around 25 staff and 12 students. Working on all things drought. I'm going to talk just a little bit about that today, but more in the context of the COP that you've heard a little bit about already. And one of the things we did was bring in we had a side session on this high-level meeting for national drought policy. And that really had started off back in 2013, and we had our +10, that's why there's a +10 there, was to talk about the various work streams at the COP, just to inform people more about what's going on synergistically globally. So I want to walk you through a little bit on sort of the monitoring, early warning, and forecasting, which includes impact. So I'll start with the conclusion slide. So there's been a lot of effort lately to move from reactive to proactive. And in fact, Dr. Will Hite, the founding director of the Drought Mitigation Center, had put together a diagram called the hydro-illogical cycle that many of you may have seen in drought meetings over the last several decades. He worked in that space for 40 years, nearly 40 years. And the idea was, now, how do we start to tailor this information, because it's not a one-size-fits-all by any means, to help individual countries or other entities develop drought resilience plans, drought mitigation plans. And I should clarify in the context of what we mean by mitigation at the Drought Center, because it is our middle name, is not greenhouse gas reduction. Okay, that's more the climate change terminology for mitigation. Ours is about any action we can do in advance of drought to reduce the effects of drought. So that's really our main goal. So how do we also integrate local knowledge into this service community? There's a lot of groups working in the drought space now. We're all starting to talk the same language finally. You know, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I'd say in the last 10 years we've come a long ways. So working with our friends and colleagues at UNCCD and Nature Conservancy and others, World Bank, just to name a few, has really, I think, moved the needle a lot exponentially in the last 10 years. So the conundrum with drought is what we've heard alluded to in the first panel, if you caught that, days to decades. This is a real issue with drought, is that it has a very potentially large spatial footprint and a very potentially long temporal footprint. Every other hazard is going to have a relatively small area that it covers, and it's going to be relatively quick hitting, maybe a few days. Droughts can last, as we've already heard this morning in the Southwest, we're coming off, maybe arguably still in a multi-decadal drought in the Southwest part of this country. Other mega droughts in Chile and many other regions just in the last 10, 20 years. So, and then we heard about flash drought with the speaker on the last panel too from Oklahoma. So this idea of rapid onset droughts is the thing I'm really going to touch on in tomorrow's session on droughts. So if I can get you to come back. Yeah, we'll have some of the same panelists, but we've got in totally different slide sets for you and ideas. The idea on that was a term I coined 25 years ago in the media initially, before doing research on this the rest of my career to this point, was on flash droughts. The idea was to change the paradigm that everyone always says drought is a slow onset disaster, right? And it is, it can be. But we've seen with the changing climate, warmer temperatures are accelerating water through the hydrologic cycle. And so it's changed the characteristics of drought, and Mr. Pope this morning touched on that when you looked at that diagram. The flip from too little to too much and vice versa really puts a strain on how you manage that resource. And it's changing, it's fluid, and we call that non-stationarity. We can't rely on the past to predict the future necessarily anymore. So we have to be light on our feet. So this is the challenge, is working with drought across space and time. The other thing I think that's a misnomer about drought is that when we talk about early warning, everyone thinks that's simply a drought forecast. And the problem is we don't do a very good job of that. Unless you're in a coastal area and you're in a strong, maybe oceanic oscillation phase that's relative to your climate, we don't have a strong correlation of what's going to mean drought in our landlocked areas where most of the primary agriculture occurs. So how do we do a better job of integrating both monitoring and forecasting? That's the point there. Providing usable distilled information for decision makers, resource managers, and producers. That's really one thing we've really focused on at the Drought Center and throughout our history. And then ideally, linking the three pillars up, which we'll talk more about tomorrow as well, those triggers are critical because they need to be tied to a drought plan. You can have a great drought plan if you don't have triggers. What's going to enable or enact action in the plan. Conversely, if you have a great trigger system and no plan, well, what are those triggers going to, again, lead to any action if you don't have a drought plan? So that's where we've really tried to move the needle in doing that. So just a few more slides here, but I wanted to touch on some of the latest advances in drought early warning, monitoring, if you will. And one of those is integrating in machine learning. No doubt about it. When I first started and did the U.S. Drought Monitor back in '99, I had 5 products at my disposal, and 3 were sent to me by mail. Now that shows how old I am because there wasn't email yet. It just started, and the internet was pretty new as well. Now, just 5 short years after that, in early 2000s, we had geographic information systems that could digest large data sets, overlay lots of different layers across the hydrologic system, and start to improve our spatial resolution and our temporal resolution. Where we are now is sort of what I liken to, if you're a Terminator fan, Rise of the Machines. The machines now can crunch high-resolution data from many disparate sources very fast and spit out a map here very quickly. Now, you have to validate and verify these. You can't just trust everything that a computer spits out. But this is our first best guess for our authors to make the U.S. Drought Monitor. That same methodology, based on a percentile ranking system, has led to efforts with the Drought Mitigation Center and some of our partners in the room here to take that and sort of how do we help other countries do this using their own blueprints. So they're looking at what we've done, but they've taken, you'll notice the droughts have some similar characteristics, but they're all a little bit different. What inputs in Australia are going to be a little bit different than what we're doing in Southern Africa and Asia, et cetera. Brazil, however, does theirs exactly the way we do the U.S. Drought Monitor. We worked with them and trained them on a World Bank project. Spent a lot of time down there. They just celebrated their 10th year anniversary last fall. They started just in the Nordeste region in the Northeast, a more drought-prone area, and now they are countrywide as of last year. Australia does it in a purely sort of machine learning-based way, and we do projects, the last two there on the bottom right are for the World Bank, are also machine learning based. So to wrap up, what sort of challenges are we looking at going forward? I already touched on sort of the warming climate and what's that doing to the characteristics of drought. What's it doing we're much more aware of. We saw with the nature-based systems that Kari touched on. So ecological drought too, and the importance of those ecosystem services. Health, which I'm sure Jesse will touch on, so I won't steal his thunder on that. Kelly touched on transboundary. And, these climate shocks are important, both too much and too little, on how we deal with food and water security. So drought is a big stressor on the environment. It's a big stressor on our systems. The markets are global, et cetera. This is all very important going forward, and how it's a big sandbox. So how do we coordinate those activities between all the groups that are dealing with drought? And another one I'll mention that Kelly, I'll give her a primer for her talk tomorrow afternoon, is about the efforts we're doing in drought impact collection. So this has been a relatively newer parameter to monitor that was not there until about 20 years ago. We started this drought impact reporter database. We've moved more recently on an initiative and cooperative agreement with the UNCCD to develop the Africa Drought Tracker that I'm just showing a teaser for you, and Kelly will talk much more about that tomorrow. But my main point is here is you can't monitor what you don't measure. And we weren't monitoring that when it comes to impacts, and now we are. And we're seeing more efforts globally, and now we're starting to build that baseline that we can tie to indicators and have a little bit of idea where we're more at risk when drought does come. And then risk management, of course, is how the center was founded. On the drought mitigation planning and integrated drought risk management. There were 3 states in the early 1980s that had drought plans, and now we have, I believe, 47. So I think the Drought Center's had a big hand in a couple dozen of those states' efforts. Our material's always up there, freely available for people to use, and then and many times they've engaged us directly. All right, so with that, I appreciate it, and I'll take a question. Thanks.
Do we have a question from the audience? For Mark, world's foremost expert in drought monitoring. Now is your shot. Now's your chance.
I'll be here all week.
Yeah. All right. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just curious, as you were talking through that, 47 states now have drought plans. How has that changed over time, like what those drought plans look like? Because I think as we're talking about supporting national drought plans through this new commitment.
Thanks, Kari. That $20, I appreciate that got me something. Or Daniel gave me $20 to ask that question. No, that's a perfect question. So the vast majority of them early on were purely response-oriented. There were maybe just 3 or 4 that were mitigation plans, truly more proactive in nature. Now I'd say it's a third of those states of the 47, so we still have a lot of, hopefully, job security or work to do, depending on how you look at it. So a lot of them are still response-oriented. And not to say that response isn't an element of that, but we need more of the other mitigation activities, things you can do to, again, reduce impacts across sectors, across state borders, across countries, et cetera. So a lot more work to do, but we are having there is more momentum. National Integrated Drought Information System, our work is fed into that effort to move more to the proactive side of things. Thanks.
And I would also note that we've seen drought plans go from being standalone drought plans, maybe within a state ag department, to being part of emergency management. Water plans now include drought, so it's going mainstream. It's not its own thing anymore. That's also.
And tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about that at scale too, down to the.
Yes.
In the last 10 years, individuals, farmers, ranchers, communities, American Planning Association, drought-ready communities. There's been a lot of efforts on that part of the scale versus just national. So we'll talk about that more tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Now our final speaker is Jesse Bell he is the, let me get it right, the Claire M. Hubbard Professor of Water, Climate, and Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks for being here today. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad that I'm able to follow up with all these excellent talks because I'm going to be talking about drought and health. And when we were talking about the work streams that have happened through the high-level meeting on drought, health was the 9th and last work stream. So it was added a little bit late, but thanks to Daniel and Mark for realizing the importance of that potential interaction between drought and health. And that often happens. Drought is not always seen as a health issue. But there is a number of different ways that drought is impacting health. And there is a strong connection. And I want to talk through some of those. One, when we look back over the last century, drought has likely caused more deaths than any other climate or weather-related disaster. And that's primarily due to famine and malnutrition. And so that just kind of signifies some of those impacts. Floods have likely impacted more people, but droughts have likely led to more deaths. But as Daniel mentioned, drought is a threat multiplier. And so unlike some of these other climate and weather-related disasters, drought doesn't really have that initial onset that we see with like hurricanes or heat waves. And so there is a little bit more, to some extent, a little bit slower onset. So you don't see that initial hit that can be related back to human health outcomes. The health outcomes can manifest over time. And that's partially due to the changes in the environment that we see. So whether it's heat waves, wildfires, changes in air quality, changes in water availability and water quality, and even changes in vector habitat and certain diseases, such as Kelly has done some work around mosquitoes in West Nile here in Nebraska with drought. And so because of that, you see all these different changes that can happen over those weeks, months, years that drought can impact an area. And through each of those pathways, we can see adverse human health outcomes. And so this is what this figure is trying to illustrate. In the middle, we have all the different ways that we can see drought manifesting within the environment, changes in precipitation, changes in water availability. And then those things, like I mentioned, have changes in the environment. And those changes in the environment then lead to adverse human health outcomes. And so one of the things that we know when a disaster, any disaster happens, we know that there are more deaths with those indirect pathways than the direct. The direct is what gets all the attention. That's the headline grabber. But what we're not paying attention to are the things that happen weeks, months, years after that event occurs. And that's where we see many more deaths than that initial impact. And that is drought in the way that it manifests just in general. And so here's a number of news stories across the globe about the ways that drought is impacting society. We see these impacts everywhere. And so when we think of drought is has societal impacts. As Daniel mentioned, there are certain populations that are more impacted than others. A lot of times it's rural populations. And it's individuals, women are more impacted globally by drought events. And we even see that here in the United States as well. We found that more women die from respiratory-related deaths in the United States associated with drought than men. And so when we talk about drought, it's important to try to figure out what are our next steps. What is it that we need to do in order to address some of these issues? And Kari gave wonderful case studies, and Mark gave case studies as well, the ways that these are being implemented. That's one of the issues with drought and health. There are not a lot of case studies globally on how we're integrating health into drought management and planning. And so there's a lot more opportunities that need to occur to make sure that we're doing this, because that's how we save lives and that's how we reduce impacts on society. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that we have more research. I can actually probably name the number of researchers that are working on drought and its impacts on human health on one, maybe two hands globally. And so there are not a lot of people that are in this space and not a lot of research in this space. So there's a lot of opportunity to expand and understand some of these pathways and the complexity of these pathways and how that can relate back to human health. We also need to make sure that we're doing engagement, especially with public health departments and health ministries. Understand what are their needs so that we can be able to provide resources, tools, and opportunities for them to better engage in some of these conversations. And so I think that was a great point that a number of our panelists talked about, is how sometimes it's different sectors that are looking at this individually, but it's when we bring those sectors together is when we're actually more effective in addressing some of these issues as well. And then developing strategies. To date, and I could be 100% wrong about this, but to date, I believe there's only one national strategy on integrating drought into, or integrating health into drought planning and preparedness, and that's in the United States. And we helped with creating that guidance document, that roadmap for how to better integrate public health into drought planning and preparedness. And so there's a lot of opportunity globally to make sure that what we're doing here in the US, which is our one potential case study, how we can potentially translate that to other parts of the world and learn from other parts of the world too, to make sure that we're implementing these things more effectively. And then lastly is developing tools. We need to make sure that we're developing tools to help educate and communicate around some of these issues. Public health departments, health ministries are usually tapped to about 100% of their time. And so it needs to be academics, agencies that can produce some of these tools and resources for them, for those health departments that are working on the ground, to make sure that they're planning and preparing for drought, but also communicating about the health risks to the populations that are most vulnerable and most at risk. And so these are kind of the four pillars moving forward that need to occur to make sure that we're protecting lives, reducing health risks, and making sure that we're integrating within planning and preparedness efforts nationally, globally, around drought, and making sure that health is a key component within that. And so with that, I can pause there and look forward to any questions and discussion.
Yeah. Do we have a question for Jesse?
Nope.
Yes. I think someone will bring you a microphone.
I'm covered. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the presentation, Jesse. I feel like I have to ask this question since you're the public health speaker. Those four pillars seem very important, and drought is clearly a topic related to climate change. And given the current funding situation in the US, where those are dirty words, I'm wondering, what do we do to continue to make sure those four pillars are robust? And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say there are some definite challenges around this. Climate change is impacting drought, as some of our other panelists have talked about, and we are seeing more frequent and more intense droughts, and especially in certain parts of the world. With that being the case, no matter what anybody feels about climate change climate itself still exists. Seasons are climate. Year-to-year variability is climate. Where you live, your geography of where you live is climate. And so we still need to make sure that we're better adapting and understanding the potential impacts and mitigating against the impacts of just climate in general, because we don't do a good enough job at that. In the United States, more people, I said drought internationally has likely led to more deaths. In the US, it's heat waves. Heat waves likely lead to more deaths in the US than any other climate or weather-related disaster. And so we still have major challenges to face just in addressing some of these issues. And so the way that I look at this is with the work that we're doing, we're helping with building preparedness and planning around some of these major key issues around drought and reducing health impacts. And so I don't know what the future of the US funding is going to look like. I would be interested in finding out who would know what that would look like, because I'd love to talk to them. But even with that being the case, I think there's some major opportunities to move forward to continue to do this work, because whether or not we want to have a conversation about climate change, we need to have a conversation about climate, and we need to have a conversation about things like drought, because they're going to occur. And each time that they occur, if we're not doing things in planning and preparedness, they're going to cause deaths. They're going to cause health outcomes. And so we need to make sure that we're integrating public health into those decision-making opportunities to reduce impacts. That's the best I can do in answering that question.
Thanks, Jesse.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to lead off with? I do, if others don't, but yes, please. Did you raise your hand? Yeah, okay. Yes, I think someone will.
Sorry, I had my eye on another gentleman that raised his hand. Apologies.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the speakers. Wonderful presentations. One thing that, that catches my mind when we talk about drought is sometimes when you ask a question, how to prevent drought. But I think that's sometimes the question where you think how to prevent a tornado, right? When you see a tornado, you generally run. And Mark here mentioned there are different types of a drought. I don't understand too much of it, but there are different types, right? One thing that I have not heard about when dealing with drought is domestic immigration policy. When you got issues and people need to go, there must be some type of integration between drought and immigration policy. Have you given this any consideration? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I can't remember if I threw that in on a slide tomorrow, and maybe the rest of the panel have a thought. I know Daniel probably will for sure. And the short answer is absolutely yes. I mean, we've worked in countries, I've done a lot of work in the Middle East, North Africa, and we've seen this, obviously, one of the contributing factors to massive migration, both in major droughts from rural to urban, which stresses urban systems to collapse and fail on many occasions. This goes back decades. You can look at many cases from many countries. The drought in Syria that led to mass migration there, in fact, being and working on a project with, at the time, USAID in Lebanon and Jordan, seeing that they had a 30% increase in population needs food and water. This put a lot of strain on that. So that's across borders, and then we've seen the same thing in Libya to Tunisia and many other examples. So droughts have, as neither Jesse or I showed that slide this time because I thought you would show it, so I didn't steal it from you. I think you mentioned it verbally a little bit, though, that droughts have led to the demise of civilizations. Well, this is why. Widespread famine. In the past, you could just pick up and move. You could go somewhere else and find greener pastures, find water. That system doesn't work very well now with borders and visas and immigration, as you're touching on. So drought's a wicked issue, right? We're not going to solve all that, and we're not going to drought-proof anybody, right? I kind of cringe when I heard drought-proof, because I think we can reduce the impacts a lot, but they're still going to happen, right? No matter what. It's how resilient are you to that in the future as well as now? Where are we vulnerable? And that's why this panel is touching on so many great things to help us be more resilient. Thanks.
Thanks. Anyone else want to address that?
I can add maybe, it's going to be a repetition, but of course repetition is learning. We had this initiative, what we call 3S initiative, security, stability, and sustainability initiative in West African countries. And exactly what Mark said, drought is a threat multiplier. So when there is drought, people just don't migrate as it is, but just they try to at least adapt. It is not the first reaction for them. So there is a lot of opportunity for us to really help them to mitigate the impacts of drought before they make the move. And he was also mentioning about Syria. I didn't have a project for Syria, but I was learning a lot, and I was also reviewing one paper where there was a lot of drought from 2006 to 2011, 5 consecutive years of drought in Syria, and people were moving from rural areas to urban areas. And in the urban area, there was no opportunity, so there was civil unrest, and then they started to migrate. So I think there is ample opportunity. So everything that we do on drought and migration, I think we need to look into it. There are opportunities to mitigate the impacts before it becomes a migration issue. And we have a kind of a policy framework that will do rural-urban interface, because majority of the migration is from rural to rural areas, not rural to urban areas, by the way. And I think it is important to mention that people just follow opportunities. And they just do a kind of a strategy, household strategy. They make a calculated move. So I think drought is kind of, I think it ignites some kind of movement, but it is not this mass movement that we see forced migration as a result of drought. This is at least that we look at it in the UNCCD policy.
Yeah, thank you.
I can add just a little bit to that as well, because Daniel, I appreciate that question, because I think it's a great question, and it kind of goes back to the health component. And so you look at those pathways, all of a sudden when you see these migration events, they very easily turn into humanitarian issues, and then public health issues on top of it. With Syria and the conflict that happened there, that potentially was spurred in some part, it was a reaction by the government, and not necessarily fully supported by the drought event, but it kind of led to those conditions. When that happened and the mass migration occurred, you saw people going to other parts of the world, and then you saw countries trying to respond and figure out how to respond to that issue as well. And then that became a strain on their systems, but it also became a strain nationally, globally, across the world, as far as like how to respond to these types of issues. We see the exact same thing. There's been studies that have shown that during times of drought in Latin America, that we'll see more migration of individuals up to the United States. And then that becomes a potential national and international issue as well. And then also on top of it, even in the United States, we have history of seeing these types of events occur. In the US, during the 1930s, we had the Dust Bowl, which was a large drought event that occurred in this region. And we saw people moving out of this region because of the lack of availability of work, et cetera, and the economic impacts that was having as well. And so that's the one challenge around all of this. And that's why it's so important, if we can do the mitigation and do things on the ground within those countries, then it does not become, hopefully, a global crisis whenever one of these events occurs.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Kari, would you like to add anything on this?
No, I think
Okay.
we've said enough.
Great, great.
It was a fantastic question. Very
Thank
important
you.
issue.
And I think we had another question pending.
This is Neil Woolen with the University of Nebraska's National Strategic Research Institute, and I have a question for the group on resiliency. The term was used in some of the talks today. It's a term that seems to be gaining some momentum, where we're talking more about resiliency factors. But I also believe it's very difficult to achieve resiliency, and I think too often we think about just response, and we're just renaming it as resiliency, rather than looking at doing a deep dive on some of the factors that Mark brought up about various different types of drought, different causes, different realizations of drought, and then what Jesse talked about with the cascading effects that can happen. And oftentimes resiliency comes from how well you can downstream mitigate those cascading effects so that you're ready for the unknown event rather than actually responding and building a mitigation strategy around an anticipated event. I would like to hear the group's thoughts on, are we really building towards true resiliency, or are we just renaming response and mitigation strategies with the title resiliency?
Great question. Who'd like to lead off?
Yes, I can start maybe. I'm sure the group will say a lot. I'm very, very optimistic. The last 11 years, I think a lot of the colleagues also, we worked on drought resilience, and we were able to at least shift the paradigm. I'm sure I always keep stealing the words from Mark, from toolset to mindset. The mindset on drought has changed now. They know because reality is changing, reality dictates, it's happening very, very frequently. And now he was talking about the 47 states in the US, and globally, I can tell you that there were a handful of countries with this drought policy based on this principle of risk reduction. Now we have 80 plus countries who have a national drought plan based on principle of risk reduction. They have the step-by-step approach on what to do when drought strikes. This is resilience. When it comes to resilience, resilience is just having the mindset that it is going to be happening, and let's try to prepare for it. So there is a chain of command, what to do when, who is going to act, what are the roles of different actors. There are different alert systems, moderate drought, extreme drought, exceptional drought. So on each set of this drought phase, what are they going to do? I think this is very important. What is missing is to implement this on the ground. A lot of countries are now preparing, at least knowing what to do is very important. And now the next step with this global drought resilience initiative led by Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they are going to have at least 500,000 each for these countries. They are going to look into putting the terms on the ground. They are going to have some meteorological stations. They are going to implement, they are going to look into their national drought plans. They are going to have a committee so that they are prepared. Because drought, I think we didn't mention this in this panel, but it was treated as a crisis. For a crisis, you don't need a policy. You just react when the crisis. But this is now a risk. And it's now everyone, at least with the countries that we deal with, they know drought is a risk. It's a constant risk. And you need a policy. And almost all countries have now, those who work with us have a national drought plan. So resilience on the ground is happening. But at the policy level, I think we're able to achieve this with the paradigm shift. He was mentioning about the early warning and monitoring systems. Countries have now a vulnerability mapping. They have a drought risk profiling. Who is going to be affected where? So they have a map of their countries in terms of the drought risks. For example, Brazil, northeast of Brazil is highly affected by drought when drought strikes. So they know the dark red countries, the dark blue countries. So when drought strikes, they know where to act, who is going to be affected. So, and then the drought risk mitigation measures. We have a drought toolbox that we support with countries. There is no one size fits all, the panelists were mentioning. So context-specific drought risk mitigation measures. So they are prepared. And they are not yet resilient on the ground, but they are resilient on the mind. They have the policy, and they are ready to go to implement it. I think this is a right step in the right direction, but of course, a lot more to do. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else?
I'm sure we all have something to add on this question. It's sort of core to what we're talking about here, about building resilience. And I think reiterating that move to proactive versus reactive. And I think I would go back to the slide I showed, which was a really simple diagram of the different kinds of systems. And I'm sure that's not exhaustive of the types of systems that we need to build resilience within. But I see it as sort of building that ability to absorb those impacts of drought and other types of climatic impacts, and still be able to deliver on what people and what the systems need to have water, food, to keep moving in the direction that we're looking to move. And so, so I see there's sort of we are experts in building resilience in natural systems, and we're working really hard on thinking through how we do that and how certain ecosystems can survive, thrive under these growing extremes of conditions. But also our built systems, our reservoirs, our water delivery systems, and how those survive under different kinds of conditions. We need to make sure we build that resilience in those built systems to be able to do that. And then there's a whole variety of how we build resilience and how we're managing water. And I think that's where we have a lot of even more potential, is getting better at creating the knowledge and clarity around how water can be managed under different conditions. I think we've seen time and again that having really clear water laws, water policies, water management plans under these different conditions can have a really big impact on how people and economic systems and other systems succeed under these extremes. Having the clarity of okay, under this kind of drought condition, this is what is going to happen, and everybody knowing that ahead of time, I think is really important. So again, yes, I think resilience can sometimes be a fuzzy word, but I think to me it means being able to continue to do the things that we all need to survive and thrive under these different kinds of conditions within all of these different systems.
Yeah, Neil, great question. What I would add to that would be, another term you could use is adaptation, right? That's another one we hear mixed in that. And semantics of drought are complex. And tomorrow I'll talk more about water scarcity, desertification, these other terms that tend to be lumped in with drought. I'll go back to what I mentioned in the talk this morning real briefly. I would say the biggest challenge is non-stationarity, is that if you're expected to bounce back to where you were before, but it's so fluid now that that bar has moved, that marker has moved. Is that the expectation? I mean, look at the Colorado River the last couple decades. Will we ever refill meter POW when it's already over allocated? And speaking of that region, the shift from, is that a climate change shift to aridity that we've hit a tipping point? Or are we expected to bounce back to something before that mega drought in the Southwest? Cities are still growing, but we are seeing some people moving out of California now. Demographically, everything was moving to the south, and maybe that will shift in the next 40, 50 years. I don't know. So I think, to me, that's the challenge, is sort of, it's fluid. Our risk and vulnerability is fluid, and our climate is fluid, and they're both fluid. How do we get a sense of that? That's very, very difficult for planning, in my opinion. But I think it's always a good practice to be proactive versus reactive. At the end of the day, that's what the Drought Mitigation Center is about, is helping people become more resilient in that fashion. Just prepared to reduce the impact. You're not going to stop it. I think for me, again, the bigger point is, are we shifting? When do you shift from just a drought? Looking at past historical tree ring analyses, we know we've had these 30, 40, 50-year droughts historically in that region, but we didn't have the climate variability of that nature back then either, nor did we have these mega cities in those regions either. So, just the difference in the drought of the 70s in California, which is a drought I studied in college, to the drought of the early 2010s. They went from 25 to 50 million people. That changed the whole dynamic. They're much more efficient with how they use their water. They're doing more with less. We've heard this with agriculture as well. But yet at some point, when does that outpace technology? That'll be the real tipping point at some point down the road. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question, and I'll try to keep my answer brief. And I would say that one of the things that we just need to do is make sure that the health component is more integrated into some of these discussions. When we were doing regional workshops around the United States, one of the things that was most surprising to me is you had the potential state climatologist that was developing the drought plan for the state, and they had never interacted with the public health agency. And so there was no integration in that. And so if you want to build resilience, especially within these systems, making sure that we're doing it in that multi-sectoral way. But in that same capacity, one of the points that we would point out to water managers and to people working on natural resources is if your system is resilient to drought events, and if you are doing planning and preparedness, then you are serving public health in some capacity, because if your system doesn't fail, then there's no potential health outcomes. But if your system fails in some way, that's when we'll likely see health outcomes from this. And just making sure that we're having those holistic conversations and having everybody at the table to kind of talk through what are the potential cascading impacts, as you mentioned.
Thank you all. Do we have another question for the panel? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Jenny Barron. I'm from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. So I'll bring my question more from an agriculture perspective. And my question is, there has been, and it's fantastic to see the awareness and the preparations and the knowledge going into drought preparedness. But as our speakers in the previous session said, well, we also have you call it flood, but the excessive moisture conditions that, at least for agriculture, is equally harmful and challenging to manage in our food systems and for the farmers. So how does your work relate to that other condition that we need to prepare for, and specifically then related to agriculture? Thank you.
Take first crack, and Daniel can probably fill in for what I'm forgetting here. This has been an area of focus, I'd say, for about 10 years now, the extremes of too much, too little. There's a few documents out there now about this where those communities are talking together, just kind of like drought and fire doing the same thing, that getting back to Jesse's point, more holistically. But was it the World Bank worked with Delft on the sort of an international bunch of case studies on too much, too little? I forget the name of the document. The EPIC report, correct. If you Google EPIC report on drought flood, I think you would find that document right away. But there were some other efforts even before that took a while to get traction. But now I think people understand that producers on the ground, water managers, they have to deal with both extremes, right? So we understand our specialty might be drought, but we understand we need to work with our colleagues in those areas.
We'll go this way maybe. Yeah, I think it's a really important question because, and the report that I showed on accelerating adaptation looked at both flooding and drought and the role of nature-based solutions and other solutions to address the increasing risks of both of those. And in many of the places we work, they're facing both, right? And especially in agricultural systems. And I think the question came up this morning, how do we capture that water during the wetter times so we can make it through some of the drier times, even in any given year, through the wet season and dry season? So I think looking for solutions in soil management and other kinds of practices that can help us do that is really important. We have some examples of how we've worked on in systems where we capture water and infiltrate it, use farmland in certain seasons and sort of wetter seasons to then infiltrate that water into the groundwater system. We do this in Washington and California, which helps the groundwater system and helps have water for farmers later in the year. So I think looking for those win-win solutions, for example, that like floodplain restoration and protection, because floodplains are really important in that kind of mechanism, as well as working with farmers on different kinds of practices to help on both ends of the spectrum, I think are really, really important. But it's a challenge because, as you see, we're here talking just about drought, and I think there's that, just like some of the other issues we mentioned, there is that kind of, it's taken a while for those things to come together and for people to talk about both at the same time in terms of managing for both.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very important question. Talking about agriculture, we have a gentleman there leading this global framework for water scarcity in agriculture, FAO. It's a working group, and we are part of that working group. We are trying to also make sure that there is this land, especially drought nexus markers in that SPI report where land-based interventions or land-smart interventions for drought management. So we can, trying to really work on drought issues, but based on investing on the land. So what we keep talking to people or to communities is when you talk about drought, don't look up, but look down. Can you still grow crops? So I think land smart, this is how they call it, drought smart land management, DSLM. So trying to really bring this drought and land nexus together is very, very important. And of course, I think this agricultural droughts, when drought strikes, meteorological drought is one drought where you have less than average rainfall, but there is no impact. But hydrological drought, rivers start to also run dry. But then agricultural drought, it's where it starts to hit crops and livestock. So yes, we are aware of that. We look into other disasters like sun and dust storms, for example, and we try to also look into how we can create jobs from land. So there is a lot that you can do around droughts, but now the topic is drought, and that's why we were discussing a bit on that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that is a great point. And I would just say that we need to bring more people to the table to be talking about these issues. I think about here in Nebraska, and Mark, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe in 2011, we had a major flood event that was very impactful, especially for rural areas. And then in 2012, we had a major drought that was incredibly impactful. And then in 2019, we had a really impactful flood. And then 2020 or 2021, we had a very impactful drought in this region. And so we're seeing these types of events coming one after another, and you don't get a chance to kind of step back and adjust. And with our changing climate, we're going to continue to see these types of things coming one after another and having more impacts on society. And I think, and I think about the impacts it had on agriculture. Those floods destroyed crops. Next year, floods or the droughts potentially destroyed crops. What does that mean for those people that are trying to adjust to those changing systems? It's hard to even contemplate. So yeah, we need to be making sure that we're integrating more across the hydrological extremes and through other extremes as well, like Mark said with fire.
Okay. I think we're out of time this morning, so let's thank our panel.